Something historic is unfolding right now, and most Americans are watching it through a keyhole. On February 28, 2026, the United States and Israel launched what they called Operation Epic Fury, coordinated airstrikes on Iran that killed Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei and set off a chain reaction that has not stopped shaking the world since. The Strait of Hormuz, the most critical energy choke point on the planet, was effectively shut down. Brent crude oil surged to nearly $120 a barrel, close to its highest level ever recorded, while the International Energy Agency called this the largest supply disruption in the history of the global oil market. And here is the part that nobody on your evening news is spending nearly enough time unpacking. While America is focused on the military campaign, two other powers are sitting back and watching the board rearrange itself in their favor. Russia and China did not fire a single shot in this war, and yet, right now, they may be the ones winning it. This is the story of how American military action in Iran is paradoxically accelerating the very global power shift that Washington has spent decades trying to prevent. This is about oil at $120 a barrel, pipelines replacing sea lanes, and a world that is quietly but decisively moving away from the architecture that America built. The December 2025 U.S. National Security Strategy treats China and Russia in isolation, offering no strategy to keep them divided. That's not a minor oversight. That is a foundational strategic failure. Because what the war in Iran has done, more than anything else, is hand Moscow and Beijing an enormous gift, wrapped in the chaos and confusion of a Middle East that is now burning. And the remarkable thing is that neither of them had to do anything overt to receive it. Let's start with Russia, because Moscow's situation here is genuinely extraordinary. The Russian economy, battered by Western sanctions and the immense costs of the war in Ukraine, was facing a precarious 2026. Russia built its federal budget on oil price assumptions of roughly $60 a barrel. Instead, the eruption of war in the Gulf sent Brent crude surging toward $120 a barrel. This windfall has rescued the Russian war budget, providing the Kremlin with the capital it needs to sustain its military operations in Europe. Think about what that means in concrete terms. The United States launched a war to destroy Iranian nuclear infrastructure, and in doing so, it doubled the price of oil overnight, which directly funded the Russian military campaign in Ukraine. You could not design a more ironic outcome if you tried. And it doesn't stop there. Putin also benefited from U.S. leader Donald Trump's decision to lift sanctions on some Russian oil and gas supplies for about a month following a phone conversation between the two presidents, with the European Commission also delaying plans to permanently ban Russian oil imports, citing current geopolitical developments. So, at the exact moment when the Gulf is in crisis, the pressure on Russian oil exports is being eased. Moscow is stepping into the supply vacuum with both hands open. Russia has also shown it is ready to benefit from the conflict through additional fuel oil shipments, higher realized prices, and a renewed strategic opportunity to present itself to Asian buyers amid the Gulf shock and growing regional demand as a politically safe and logistically reliable supplier. This is the pivot that Moscow has been trying to execute for years, away from European markets that have sanctioned it, and toward Asian buyers who need energy and don't particularly care about Western approval. The Iran war just accelerated that pivot by several years. Now here is where it gets really interesting for Russia's long-term positioning. The long-discussed Power of Siberia 2 natural gas pipeline, which Moscow has been lobbying Beijing to approve since Russia's invasion of Ukraine, would likely be Russia's biggest strategic prize, offering it a new market for about a third of the pipeline gas previously sent to Europe. The Gulf shock increases the value of that insurance as a hedge against prolonged disruption in the Middle East. China has been hesitant about this pipeline because it didn't want to become too dependent on any single supplier, but a Strait of Hormuz that can be shut down by Iranian missiles at any moment changes that calculation dramatically. Suddenly, a Russian pipeline running through land looks a lot more stable than a tanker sailing through a war zone. Russia continues to be a stable and reliable supplier of oil and natural gas to China via both land and sea routes. The Power of Siberia. Natural gas pipeline is operating slightly above capacity, and increasing volumes of Russian LNG are being delivered to China, reaching 9.8 million tons in 2025, an 18% annual increase. That trend line was already going up before the Iran war. Now the Gulf crisis has turbocharged it. Every day that the Strait of Hormuz remains disrupted is another day that Chinese energy planners look north toward Russia rather than south toward the Persian Gulf. And there's a detail buried in the energy data that almost nobody is talking about. China relies on imports for 85% of its helium, of which Qatar alone supplied 54% last year. Russian helium exports to China averaged 38 million cubic feet per month in 2025, up 60% year-on-year, and December volumes reached 71 million cubic feet, suggesting a substantial ramp-up. Helium isn't just for balloons, it's critical for semiconductor manufacturing. China's entire advanced technology industry depends on it, and with Qatar's facilities struck and shut down, Russia is moving in to fill that gap too. This is not accidental. This is what a strategic partnership looks like in practice, filling voids quietly, methodically, while attention is elsewhere. Now let's turn to China, because Beijing's story here is more subtle and in some ways more consequential. China's approach to this crisis has been one of studied restraint on the surface. But underneath that restraint is a very sophisticated maneuvering that serves Chinese interests extraordinarily well. Iran has long served as a vital discounted source of energy for China. By the end of 2025, China was importing up to about 1.4 million barrels per day from Iran, representing 13% of its total crude imports and some 80 to 90% of Tehran's oil exports. So China is losing a major discounted energy supplier. That's a real cost. But the way Beijing is navigating around that cost is instructive. On March 26, the foreign minister of Iran announced that ships owned by 5 nations, including China, Russia, India, Iraq, and Pakistan, would be allowed to transit the Strait of Hormuz. Iran, in the middle of a war with the United States, is making exceptions for Chinese ships. That is not a coincidence. That is the fruit of years of strategic investment in the relationship, and it gives China a supply lane that its competitors and adversaries simply don't have access to. Beijing was unable to shield Tehran from the US-Israel attacks, exposing the limits of its cautious approach to regional security. While avoiding direct intervention, Beijing has mobilized to protect its nationals by arranging the evacuation of more than 3,000 Chinese citizens from Iran. China's public position has been morally firm, but operationally restrained. Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi condemned the killing of Iran's supreme leader, calling it the blatant killing of a sovereign leader, but Beijing has stopped short of any concrete interventions or coercive diplomacy. This is Beijing doing what Beijing does best, speaking the language of international law and sovereignty while keeping its powder completely dry and protecting its economic interests on the ground. And here is the longer game that China is playing. If the US becomes more deeply involved in a war against Iran, China could gradually shift away from its current cautious stance and expand its role in the Iranian market, similarly to what it has done in Russia. China could become much more of an enabler in the economic survival of the Iranian regime and could support its defense capabilities through dual technology exports, helping facilitate an Iranian campaign of attrition against the US. This is the pattern we saw in Ukraine. China didn't send tanks, but it kept Russia's economy alive and supplied the components that Russian factories needed to keep making weapons. The same playbook could unfold in Iran. A protracted military conflict in Iran would divert US military resources away from the Indo-Pacific, with potentially major consequences for the future of Taiwan and the South China Sea. Observing US naval operations in real time in the Gulf could also prove very valuable for China if tensions in the Strait of Taiwan were to flare up. This is a point that deserves to sit in your mind for a moment. Every carrier group America has committed to the Gulf region is a carrier group that is not in the Pacific. China's military planners are watching American naval tactics, American response times, American coordination with allies, all of it in real time. This conflict is a live training exercise from Beijing's perspective, and they didn't have to pay a single yuan to run it. Now let's talk about what's happening on the ground in terms of the global normative order, because this is where the true depth of the shift becomes visible. Wang Yi and Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov agreed during a phone call that the US-Israeli operation is a serious breach of international law and the UN Charter, with both countries calling for an emergency UN Security Council session on the conflict. This diplomatic coordination between Moscow and Beijing is not just rhetoric. It is the scaffolding of an alternative legitimacy structure, one that positions the US-led world order as the aggressor and positions Russia and China as the defenders of sovereignty. This narrative is landing powerfully in the global south. The war in Iran poses a fundamental dilemma for Russia and China. Both countries have presented themselves as alternatives to Western hegemony, but such rhetoric requires credible security backing and deterrence. The apparent ineffectiveness of Russian air defense systems in Iran is a particular blow to Moscow's credibility. This is the honest complexity that careful analysis demands. Russia supplied Iran with the Qayyam spy satellite and reportedly began delivery of Su-35 fighter jets. Russia's contributions focus on heavy military hardware and dedicated orbital reconnaissance, with the Qayyam satellite providing Iran with high-resolution imagery, allowing Tehran to monitor US and Israeli bases. And yet, Iran still suffered devastating strikes. So what does that tell you? It tells you that military technology transfer, even at a sophisticated level, cannot substitute for the full weight of American military power when Washington decides to apply it without hesitation. But here is the question that military analysts are wrestling with right now, and it's a question that has profound implications for every country that's been watching this conflict. If China and Russia allow a partner like Iran to be dismantled without visible escalation, what message does that send to every country in the global south that has been tilting toward the multipolar camp? If Moscow and Beijing allow a key node like Tehran to be dismantled without a visible escalation of support, they risk a credibility deficit that could alienate other potential partners in the global south. This is the razor's edge that both Moscow and Beijing are walking right now. They want the strategic benefits of America's overextension without triggering a direct confrontation with US military power. Russia is faced with a strategic dilemma. Should it prioritize managed distancing and diplomatic leverage, or entrench deeper into a partnership that exposes it to systemic risk and greater regional geopolitical volatility? Moscow wants to use Iran's war to its advantage, the oil revenues, the energy market positioning, the narrative capital, without getting dragged into a shooting war with the United States. That's a very delicate dance. Meanwhile, the economic consequences of this war are flowing through the global system in ways that are fundamentally asymmetric. And that asymmetry is important. A sustained conflict and the prolonged closure of the Strait of Hormuz beyond the end of March will create cost-push inflation worldwide through elevated energy, commodity, and transportation prices. 0.4% to 0.8% could be added to global inflation rates and growth could slow. Western economies, still recovering from Ukraine-related shocks, could see renewed competitiveness losses as energy costs bite harder and inflationary pressures resurface. China, however, seems more insulated from the energy shock, as it is suffering from deflationary pressures with virtually no wage growth. This is a remarkable and underreported dynamic. The same oil price spike that is hammering Western economies and straining Western central banks is landing on a Chinese economy that, because of its deflationary pressures, can absorb that inflationary hit far more effectively than Europe or even parts of the United States can. The head of the International Energy Agency described the situation caused by the war as the greatest global energy security challenge in history, and yet the very nations most challenged by that crisis are the Western nations that initiated the military action. The contradiction at the heart of American strategy here is profound. The stated goal is to prevent Iran from obtaining a nuclear weapon, but the method chosen to achieve that goal has delivered a windfall to Russia, accelerated China's energy independence from Western-controlled sea lanes, given Beijing real-time intelligence on American naval operations, and created an oil shock that is disproportionately damaging the Western economies that depend on stable energy prices. Strategy requires weighing costs and benefits across multiple dimensions simultaneously, and by that measure, the architecture of this campaign has serious problems that Washington has yet to honestly reckon with. The conflict is raising fundamental questions about China and Russia's influence in the region and their wider multipolar ambitions, but here's the deeper truth. The multipolar world isn't something that China and Russia are building entirely on their own. It's something that American overextension is building for them brick by brick, with every misstep, every alliance strained, every norm eroded. This reflects the erosion of alliance structures and the loss of a coherent framework to prevent Sino-Russian alignment. When America launched this operation, it did not consult its key allies. Australia's Prime Minister said publicly that Canberra wasn't consulted before the strikes were carried out. When Trump called on allies to help safeguard the passage of tankers through the Strait of Hormuz, Australia said it wouldn't be participating, not least because it hadn't received a direct request. These are the little cracks in the Western alliance structure that Moscow and Beijing note carefully and file away for future use. China and Iran signed a 25-year comprehensive strategic partnership agreement in 2021, while Russia and Iran signed a 20-year comprehensive strategic partnership treaty in 2025. And in January, the three countries signed a trilateral strategic pact. These are institutional commitments, treaties, frameworks They don't disappear because one member of the partnership gets bombed. If anything, they harden. The Iranian regime, despite the economic harm from the US-Israel attacks, was considered unlikely by intelligence reports to be toppled by such damage in the short term, and the fragmented Iranian opposition could not seize power on its own. So if the regime survives this, and right now the evidence suggests it will, then China and Russia will have a partner that has been tested under fire, that owes them, and that will deepen its eastward orientation with even greater urgency than before. From Beijing's perspective, US actions in both Iran and Venezuela may also be interpreted through the lens of great power competition, given that both countries are major energy suppliers to China. Significant political change in either country will likely force China to rely more heavily on Russia for its energy security, further reshaping global energy alignments. There's that thread again. Every time the United States applies pressure to a country in the Chinese energy orbit, it pushes Beijing deeper into Russia's arms on energy. And energy in the 21st century is geopolitics. Energy is power. Energy is the foundation on which everything else gets built. The world that is emerging from this crisis is not the world that American strategists envisioned when they launched Operation Epic Fury. It is a world where Russia's war chest is filled by record oil prices. It is a world where China is quietly guaranteed shipping lanes that its competitors cannot access. It is a world where the power of Siberia 2 pipeline looks more attractive to Beijing than it did 6 months ago. It is a world where the narrative that America is a destabilizing force rather than a stabilizing one is spreading through the global south with new credibility. And it is a world where the Russia-China strategic partnership, which American policymakers have long hoped to prevent from fully crystallizing hegemony, is being cemented in real time by the very pressure that was supposed to weaken it. None of this means America's military dominance is gone. It is not. The United States has definitively demonstrated that it is the only great power willing to make significant sacrifices for its partners when interests align. That is real. American military power is unmatched in its reach and its lethality. But military power is only one dimension of global influence. There is also economic power, normative power, the power of alliances, the power of legitimate standing in the eyes of the world, and it is precisely those dimensions that are being quietly eroded while the bombs fall on Tehran. The global power shift is not a future scenario. It is happening right now in the oil markets, in the pipeline negotiations, in the shipping lanes, in the UN Security Council chambers, and in the calculations of every government from New Delhi to Ankara to Lagos that is watching this conflict and drawing its own conclusions about where the world is headed and whose side it wants to be on when it gets there.